Hey, what's going on, Twisters? So for this video, I decided to do something a little bit different here. Today, we're going to talk about the best Stanley Cup matchups that we never got to see. So what I mean by that is that maybe a team had a historic regular season, but then got upset in the playoffs and missed an opportunity to play another team that had a dominant run and featured Hall of Fame players, for example. So in total, I have 7 matchups that I want to highlight and a bunch of honorable mentions. And thank you so much for your suggestions in our community tab. We'll use some of those. And comment down below, guys, what is your favorite Stanley Cup finals ever? Whether that's your favorite team winning the cup, or perhaps just objectively a great Stanley Cup final that maybe went the distance of 7 games. And we'll be putting out all sorts of videos and live streams throughout the playoffs. So if you're new here and want to react to the madness with the rest of us, be sure to stick around. All right, so the first matchup we want to talk about here was 1993, which could have been the Pittsburgh Penguins against the Los Angeles Kings. The Penguins had a historic season, 119 points in the regular season, a franchise high. They were the back-to-back Stanley Cup champions in 91 and 92. All sorts of Hall of Famers on that roster. Mario Lemieux only played 60 games because of lymphoma, but even though he missed 2 months, he scored 69 goals, nice, and 91 assists and won a bunch of major awards. However, as you might know, the Penguins were upset by the New York Islanders in the second round in Game 7 on a goal in overtime from David Volek. And the reason why I have this number 1 for me is because we could have had Mario Lemieux versus Wayne Gretzky and the LA Kings. The Kings weren't necessarily supposed to be in this position. They were on a Cinderella run. They had just 88 points in the regular season, but some of that has to do with the fact that Wayne Gretzky was limited to just 45 games. He was having a really good playoffs though. And we can't forget some of the other Hall of Famers who were on these rosters, including Luc Robitaille, who would later become a Pittsburgh Penguin, in addition to Jaromir Jagr and Ron Francis, among others. Now, instead, the matchup we got in the final was Canadiens versus Kings. The Canadiens having that 10-game winning streak in overtime. They won the Stanley Cup final. However, the Kings had to beat the Toronto Maple Leafs in 7 games, and we remember the Carey Fraser missed high stick on Wayne Gretzky in Game 6. So theoretically, we could have also had Maple Leafs versus Canadiens, and that would be the first time that we had that matchup in the final since 1967, the last Stanley Cup awarded in the original 6 era, and of course, won by the Maple Leafs. Now let's get to our second matchup. So in the 2010s, it's pretty amazing that we didn't have the Chicago Blackhawks against the Pittsburgh Penguins. These two teams combined for 6 Stanley Cups from 2009 to 2017 and would have presented an incredible matchup of Sidney Crosby, Yevgeny Malkin, and Chris Letang for Pittsburgh, and Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews, and Duncan Keith. That's a lot of future Hall of Famers. I think the best year that we could have seen these two meet up in the Stanley Cup final would either be 2010 or 2014. When we look at 2010, the Penguins were trying for back-to-back Stanley Cups, but unfortunately, Pittsburgh ran into Yaroslav Halak, who was red hot in the playoffs there for the Canadiens, and the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup against the Philadelphia Flyers. Then in 2014, well, for one, these two teams actually matched up in the Stadium Series. The Blackhawks were the defending champion, and the Penguins had one of their best seasons in franchise history, but both teams were knocked out in 7 games by the LA Kings for Chicago in overtime, and the Penguins were knocked out by the Rangers. Now, speaking of which, we want to channel a couple of honorable mentions here. So the first of which is Chicago versus New York. We've got this comment here from Brandon. It would have been great to watch 2 original 6 teams, absolutely. Not to mention, Game 7 was actually the difference maker in 2014 and 2015, because otherwise we could have had the Blackhawks versus the Rangers in back-to-back Stanley Cup final matchups. So in 2014, the Kings beat the Rangers in the final, but they had to beat the Blackhawks in the conference final, Game 7 of overtime. And in 2015, it was Ben Bishop for Tampa who outdueled Henrik Lundqvist. So we would have had Lundqvist and the Rangers meeting up with the Blackhawks that year too. And the other honorable mention I want to talk about for just a second is per this comment from Roy, and that would be Blackhawks versus Capitals. So specifically looking at 2015, in the second round, the Capitals lost to the Rangers in overtime on a goal from Derek Stepan in Game 7. Now, the Blackhawks and Capitals had actually met in the Winter Classic that year, and if we did see these teams meet in the finals, I mean, it would have been a real treat to have Patrick Kane facing off against the Hart Trophy runner-up from that year, Alex Ovechkin. My third matchup is based on this comment here from Patrick Kane fan, and so for 1986, I have either the Hartford Whalers or the Quebec Nordiques versus the Edmonton Oilers. So this would have been the lone time that we had seen two teams from the World Hockey Association meet up in the final. Now, some will say that the Whalers, who eventually became the Carolina Hurricanes, they faced the Oilers in 2006, so that's the closest that we ever got. But in '86, the Whalers went on a fairly improbable run. They actually swept the Nordiques in the first round, and then they fell in Game 7 in the second round against the Montreal Canadiens, who were riding a hot hand and goal in Patrick Roy. As for the Nordiques, they were more than capable of making a deep run. They had gone to the conference final the year before, and they had already proven that they could beat the Montreal Canadiens in the playoffs. So even though they got swept that year by the Whalers, they had still won the division, and they could favorably match up against Montreal. And on the other side of things for the Oilers, this was the lone year between 1983 and '88 that they didn't go to the Stanley Cup final. They actually had 119 points that year, but they were knocked out in the second round by the Calgary Flames in Game 7, and what decided that was an own goal from Edmonton's Steve Smith. Now let's get to our fourth matchup, and it's kind of based on this comment here from Master Chonk. And I actually have chosen the Sabres versus the Canucks in 2007. So Buffalo in the mid-2000s there had assembled a very potent roster. In the 2006-7 season, they had won the President's Trophy. They actually had the top offense in the NHL. They were just a very deep team overall. But unfortunately, there was a team that they didn't match up all that well against in the regular season, and that was the Daniel Alfredsson-led Ottawa Senators. They beat the Sabres 5 out of 8 times in the regular season, and then they defeated Buffalo in 5 games in the conference final. During that series, the Sabres managed only 10 goals against the late Ray Emery. Now for the Canucks, they had finished the year with 105 points, and they were fairly balanced. They had the Sedin twins, of course, a grizzled veteran Trevor Linden, who came within a Game 7 of leading that team to a Stanley Cup final in '94, a young Ryan Kessler, Salo and Oland on the backside, and they had Bobby Lou, Roberto Luongo in goal. Now they were able to beat the Stars, but after that they ran into Jean-Sébastien Giguère and the Anaheim Ducks, the eventual Stanley Cup champion. Luongo had a .930 save percentage in that series, but Jiggy, he had a .948 and held the Canucks to just 8 goals in those 5 games. The Ducks won the last 2 games in overtime as well. And as for a couple of somewhat relevant honorable mentions here, I would have the 2007 Canucks versus the Ottawa Senators. That would have been the first All-Canada Cup final since 1989's final between the Flames and the Canadiens. 2017 could have been a rematch between the Ducks and the Senators. The Ducks went to the conference final that year, and so did the Senators. They were carried by Erik Karlsson despite playing with a fractured foot. And of course, we know about the heartbreak against Chris Kunitz and the Penguins in double overtime in Game 7. And I also want to propose another matchup from 2006. We could have had Sabres versus Sharks. That was the year that Joe Thornton came over in that trade from the Boston Bruins. The Sharks were hot, but they couldn't take advantage of an interesting situation in the second round. All the top 4 seeds from the Western Conference had been eliminated, so San Jose was the top seed. But after Milan Mihalik was elbowed by Rafi Torres at center ice in Game 2, I was there, the Oilers swept the Sharks from there. All right, let's go to our 5th matchup. So we look at 1996, and I've got this comment here from Justin. I think it would have been pretty neat to see the Red Wings take on the Penguins in '96, Lemieux versus Yzerman. So yes, 96 against the Red Wings or even the Avalanche would have been a tremendous cup final. So when we look at Pittsburgh and Detroit, it would have been the best offense against the best defense. Look at these rosters, man. Lemieux, Younger, Francis, Cup champion with the Rangers, Sergei Zubov, and also Marcus Naslund going up against Steve Yzerman, Sergei Fedorov, Paul Coffey, Nicholas Lidstrom, Dino Ciccarelli, Chris Osgood, and more. Now, both teams lost in the conference final. Detroit lost to the Colorado Avalanche, the eventual champions, in 6 games. And of course, in that game, there was that hit by Claude Lemieux on Chris Draper. And the Penguins lost in 7 games to the Cinderella Florida Panthers in just their 3rd year as an NHL franchise. And as for the Penguins and the Avalanche, that would have been a battle of the league's top 2 offenses. The Avalanche, of course, boasting the talents of Joe Sakic and Peter Forsberg with Patrick Roy in goal. Now for my 6th matchup, this one's intriguing. We were talking about this being a potential Stanley Cup final for a few years there. I specifically want to focus on either 2018 or 2021 between the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Vegas Golden Knights, so the Cap Circumvention Cup final. No, I'm just kind of kidding. But anyway, the Lightning were rising to power at the end of the 2010s there. The Golden Knights in their first season go on an unbelievable run. Ultimately, they fell to the Washington Capitals, and the Caps had to overcome a 3-2 deficit in the conference final against Tampa just to get there. And I think the style of play would be really intriguing as well, with how many skilled players the Lightning had and how fast and physical the Golden Knights were playing, especially in that first season. And as for 2021, I thought the Knights looked like a team of destiny that year. They tied the Avalanche for the most points in the NHL and then beat them in the second round after losing the first 2 games. But somehow their offense went cold against the Montreal Canadiens, who went to the final and then lost to the Lightning in 5. And as an honorable mention for 2018, imagine this: the Pittsburgh Penguins lost in Game 6 in the second round against the Washington Capitals. The Penguins were back-to-back champions. They almost had a chance to compete in the final, and it would have been Vegas's Marc-Andre Fleury, who was exposed in the expansion draft, going up against his old team. So that would have been a hell of a match between an expansion team and the Penguins trying for a three-peat. We haven't seen that too often in today's NHL, the Lightning being an exception, losing in 2022. And before we get to our final matchup, I just want to call out a few honorable mentions from our comments. So first of all, Jameson, Washington versus Vancouver. I specifically look at the 2009-10 season. These teams had the top offenses in the NHL. They both won their divisions, and neither team had a Stanley Cup back then either. Vancouver, of course, still looking for theirs. I look at this comment here from Jerry. 98 or 1999, we could have had Buffalo Sabres and Colorado Avalanche. That would have pitted Patrick Waugh up against Dominik Hasek. Don't forget, guys, we also had Belfour versus Hasek, and then the next year we had Ed Belfour and the Dallas Stars against Martin Brodeur. So if you like goaltending duels, that would have been one for the ages. And then this comment here from James, Oilers versus Canadiens in 1986. That Edmonton team versus a rookie Patrick Waugh. I talked about that Oilers team earlier. Look at this, Patrick Waugh had 14 goals saved above average in those playoffs as a rookie, and imagine him going up against Wayne Gretzky and the top offense that year in the Oilers. And just 2 more personal picks from yours truly. Yes, as a Sharks fan, what if we got to see Jumbo Joe Thornton against the Boston Bruins either in 2011 or 2019, especially in 2011, that would have been intriguing. They lost in the conference final to the Vancouver Canucks. And then another one I wanted to point out here, 1976, 77, or 78, it would have been interesting to see the French connection line for the Buffalo Sabres up against the dynasty Montreal Canadiens. The Sabres did reach the final in 1975, but ran into those Broad Street Bullies. I wanted to see how they would have matched up against that skilled Montreal Canadiens dynasty, especially with some French Canadian talents on the Buffalo side as well. And for our final matchup, I chose in 1971 or maybe even 72, the Chicago Blackhawks against the Boston Bruins. So it would have been the defending champion Bruins from 1970. They had the best record in the NHL in the 71 season, and they would have played the Chicago Blackhawks, who were the only original 6 team to have moved to the West Division, and so all the other original 6 teams were in the East Division. It would have been something to see Phil Esposito, the NHL's leading scorer in the 1970s, take on his brother Tony Esposito in goal. He had been the MVP runner-up the previous year. You had several other Hall of Famers, including Johnny Busick, Bobby Orr, and Jerry Cheevers for Boston against Stan Mikita and Bobby Hull for the Blackhawks. The Bruins lost in 7 to the eventual champion Montreal Canadiens in the first round, and the Habs went on to beat the Blackhawks in 7 games in the final, but I think Boston versus Chicago would have been amazing there. We eventually saw those teams meet up in 2013. Anyway, Twisters, what's your favorite Stanley Cup final matchup? Let me know in the comments down below, and stick around for all sorts of content throughout the playoffs and beyond, and see the video description if you want to follow me on social media or pick up some Twisted Wrister hockey merch like this snazzy hooded sweatshirt I have featuring Cortana. In Quebec Nordiques colors, we have our logo recolored for every single NHL team and even some defunct teams as well. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'm Nick, and I'll see you Twisters later. Ciao for now.